For many of us, class has been in session for a long time. A slow-burning blues of erudition and deep engagement. Remember the questions. Where were you when this happened? How did you feel after it? So many of us remember when we read Black Chant. So many of us felt the pure joy of reading about poets we were discovering for the first time. Admired the precise prose, the depth and breadth of the close readings and literary histories presented to us. We accepted the challenge to continue the work undertaken. We heard the music between the lines and immediately wanted to be part of the band. A band that ALDON L. NIELSEN was leading. Then we read the other books, Reading Race, C.L.R. James' Critical Introduction, Writing Between the Lines, Integral Music, Inside Songs of Amiri Baraka, the work on Lorenzo Thomas, Don't Deny Me My Name, and the collected poems with his former student Laurie. The anthologies of Black poetry with Laurie Shire and many others. And so we marveled and kept on reading. It's a large corpus. Then we met him at conferences, sitting front row, camera in hand, ready to capture the image and the moment, the words and the feelings, the conversations waiting to happen. We got his questions and understood that behind them was a helping hand, a perceptive reader of our work, always willing to contribute, to exchange, to unlock what we couldn't at the time. He had been there before. We took in the advice offered with his legendary generosity, and so we found a mentor and a great friend. And we met him in the conference hotel lobby bar and realized that we were in the presence of a storyteller who had met everyone, read everything, listened to every record, played every instrument we dreamed of playing, and instead of feeling jealous or envious, we felt simply lucky and privileged to be a listener, sitting across this kind and generous man. We felt that the stories were part of a class, a corpus, and a curriculum that exists outside conventional parameters. A glass of Merlot, unsweetened iced tea, and the stories. And so we listened. We read the poetry, never put down these collections ever again. We go back to them often, to heat strings, evacuation routes, stepping razor, vexed, mixage, mantic semantic, tray. You didn't hear this from me, spider comb. For the mastery of form, the adventures in lineation, the humor, the coded allusions, the political commentary, the inspiration pulsating across stanzas. You would meet him in London, England, and he'd give you a copy of A Brand New Beggar, and that became your memory of London, the time capsule. Then one day you offered to help put together a selected poems, and many months later you got an email with a version of Let's Do It in it. And this project became one of the most emotional and important journeys of your career. The honor for which there are no words, the work of a lifetime placed in your hands with trust. Then we heard ALDON play the blues and we got it. The scholarship, the poetry, the stories, the friendships, the collaborations, the humor, the sharp wit, the unmistakable laughter, even in the low tones. And we, on the receiving end of these lifelong gifts, realize that we are in class. We've always been in class all this time, and we will continue to attend class as long as there will be music playing. And music there always was. There are still pages to write, verses to craft, and 12 bars to improvise upon. And so we'll keep on taking notes, because ALDON NIELSEN, according to your favorite singer, you ain't going nowhere. Many people couldn't be here today, but wanted to give a written tribute to ALDON. So what we did, inspired by Shirley, inspired by Evie, inspired by all of us here today, is that we put together a book of tributes. Ain't Going Nowhere, celebrating ALDON NIELSEN. There are tributes, but there are also blank pages at the back. And that's for you. So we have 2 copies. I'll pass them around. Please come and sign it. Alden, thank you very much for everything you did. We love you. We thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So I would like to invite Evie Shockley to provide us with an introduction.
Wow.
Good to be here with Alden and with all of Alden's people. This is not your conventional introduction. This is a poem called Status Report. Alden Nielsen, the critic who read C.L.R. James's revolutionary writing as radically inspiring literature, retiring. Professor Nielsen, the director, advisor, mentor, supporter of generations of young and not so young scholars, semi-retired. Alden Nielsen, the archivist of poets' black chants, their integral musics, their lyric, alyric, and anti-lyric voices, retiring. Alden Nielsen, the reader of Your Right Not to Remain Silent about the racism in white American poetry, satiring. Dr. Nielsen, the organizer of a host of annual conference panel jam sessions on Black literature and culture, retiring. Alden Nielsen, the owner of fashionable fedoras and snappy baseball caps, a whole hat battalion, attiring. Alden Nielsen, the scholar of all things experimentally poetic, from Amiri Baraka to Louis Zukowski, retiring from active duty. A.L. Nielsen, the brand new beggar with a heat string theory on what stepping razors and vexed spider cones have in common, untiring. Alden Nielsen, the jive-talking, foot-stomping, mouth harp and guitar-playing blues man, sitting at the crossroads. Let's meet him there.
See what I mean? All right, so this is really a celebration of our appreciation for Alden's career and for everything he's done for so many of us here in the room, who are sitting at this table, who are sitting in the crowd, who are at home still reading the books that he wrote and the poetry that he produced. So we'll just go in the order of the round table, and everyone can just say, you know, a few words about Alden. So we'll begin with Susan.
Thank you. I should note this is the second time I've been on a round table and I've had to immediately follow Evie Shockley. And it's unfair. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and I want to begin with my thanks to Alden, and really what I will say, and I promise a brief 7 to 8 minutes will sort of be elaborating on that thanks to Alden for all that he's done. One thing you should know about Alden Nielsen is he introduced Amiri Baraka to C.L.R. James. I think this is right. I was going to fact check it with Alden before giving these remarks, but then I realized that even if it isn't strictly true, it feels true. It often feels that Alden has a story about everyone, has met everyone, has read everything, or most things anyway. There is a feeling of Alden always having been there first. When I wanted to write about John Keane's experimental prose poems, I found an article by Alden on Black prose poetry. When I thought I had a revolutionary idea about panoramic thinking in C.L.R. James's American period, what did I find but a reference to panoramas in Alden's C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction. It seemed he appeared in citations, acknowledgments, and footnotes of nearly everything I read, a daunting but also comforting feeling. This ability to make connections with multiple fields and people, and the interest in a wide array of literatures, music, fields, disciplines, runs through his scholarship, but also his teaching and mentoring. When I was a scared second-year graduate student, Alden introduced me to friends and colleagues at conferences because he also, it seems, attends every conference. And these include some of the people here. I think that was how I first met Evie Shockley. That was how I first met my now colleague, Tyrone, who's now at UB, and we're so glad that he's there. But through Alden's introductions at conferences. He is generous to a fault and advocates for his students. When I was getting ready to defend, I could trust him to intervene if anyone else on the committee used my defense as a chance to spar with each other. He was in my corner. He staunchly protects all his students. ALDON NIELSEN, this is the second thing I want us all to know. ALDON NIELSEN writes and thinks against the given, against, in his words, assumed facts, not in evidence. That's from Black Chance. He draws our attention to what has been ignored or discounted, and to the totalizing theories that depend on these occlusions. In his introduction to his book on C.L.R. James, he tells a story about James drawing the class's attention to George Jackson's origin in prison, which leads into a thoughtful meditation on the centrality of spaces of confinement to American writing and thinking. Alden writes that he learned a good deal in his first class with C.L.R. James, and this is going to be a long quote, about American reading and writing practices as social acts, as frequently criminalized social acts. Our subsequent rereadings of American literature have retrieved and circulated knowledges that were always in evidence, always in plain view within American writings, but that, like Poe's purloined letter, had gone unremarked by those intent upon enforcing certain other forms of knowledge about American character and history. It should no longer be possible to read the mythos of the free-ranging, self-constituting American innocent without reading, at the same time and within the same texts, the tropes of confinement and bondage that are enabling and empowering ground of that innocence. That's the end of that long quote from Alden. Alden's work draws attention to what has gone unremarked and to the narratives, myths, and ideas that have solidified and become taken for granted. He points to these taken for granted moments, highlights what we have missed or ignored, and gestures to other stories, other narratives, and ways of seeing. This commitment to under-recognized artists and to interrogating taken for granted narratives about literature and about the social world is, of course, a thread that runs through much of his scholarship, particularly his dedication to writing about, anthologizing, and publishing collected works by experimental Black poets. He's consistent in this practice. We can trace this across his work, but it's also evident in his classrooms and in his mentoring. When I was a graduate student, he was the one who first introduced me to C.L.R. James, Wilson Harris, Kamal Brathwaite, Jacques Romain, Edouard Glissant, and I could just keep going and going and going. And he does all of this with style. I'm really glad Evie Shockley mentioned the hats and the graphic t-shirts. But I also mean literary poetic style. His book on C.L.R. James was the first of his critical work that I'd read, and it stopped me short several times because of not just its smartness, but its poetry. I'm not sure I knew before reading his work that criticism could be beautiful. One such moment that made me pause is another moment where he reflects on the centrality of confinement to narratives of freedom. This is again from that C.L.R. James book that I've returned to again and again. Toussaint Louverture's narrative links the old worlds and the new along the navigational paths of the triangle trade. His life marks middle passage and revolutionary rupture. Scattered within the floors and walls of the Chateau de Joux are the mortal remains of Toussaint Louverture, mixed with the bones of other prisoners, an eloquent, if seldom remarked, monument to imperial oppression and to the revolutionary instinct for freedom. Toussaint has become, as literally as possible, the foundation of France's continuing disciplinary apparatus, testimony to the state's desire to swallow up all that which resists its technologies of repression. Such foundational images of confinement are so pervasive within the Western text because bondage has been the condition of possibility for the American mythos of independence and freedom, end quote. My marginal note-taking system wasn't quite as sophisticated then as it is now, I hope. I hope it's gotten better, I mean. And when I was sort of reading back through this to think about what I wanted to say about Alden, I remembered that this was one of the places, and there were several others where I just wrote beautiful in the margins. Throughout his book on James, he attends to James's appreciation for language. I think here in his writing about James, we can hear a little bit of Alden's own insistence on the, quote, revolutionary capacities of the written word. Alden writes, "It is the possibility of the reiteration of the narratives of Toussaint Louverture and Nat Turner that terrifies racist power, and it is the potential of the readable word to disrupt hegemonic ideology that most engages James," this is him writing about James, but I say this is also something we can think about Alden's own writing. What remained consistent throughout James's work was his calling to read and repeat the revolutionary possibilities of language, end quote. Alden's career has often not only drawn attention to the revolutionary possibilities of language and art, but has tapped into those possibilities in his own writing. In Keener Sounds, which was originally published for a roundtable about John Keene, the first roundtable, when I had to immediately read remarks after Evie shot me. In the published version of that was published in Obsidian, Alden writes, John Keene could never be responsible for all the possible interpretations or sort of resonances of this poem that we might individually have. But he and his poem bear a responsibility toward readers, much as I and my readings bear a responsibility and ethic toward the poem and to the social acts of poetry. Each poem is itself a roiling community. There is a gathering that happens around the words, and in that reading/listening company, each brings another collection of frames of reference. Who could be responsible for all that? And yet, like any good hosts and guests, poet and audience bring offerings, respond to one another. Serious fun, serious play. Seriously? Question mark. End quote. I love this paragraph. I love the combination of attentiveness to Keene's poem combined with his question about the responsibility readers and writers bear toward each other, toward poems, toward reading. Each poem is itself a roiling community, but it is also serious fun, serious play. Reading Alden's work and being in scholarly and writerly community means being in this roiling community. He is committed to this community, and he beckons us to join him there. And I think, as the introduction also suggests, that he will continue to be in that community with us and beckoning us into that community even as he retires officially. So thank you so much for all that you've done and for helping us build that community together, Alden.
Thank you, Alden. It's wonderful, and everyone else for being here. It's funny, I'm very glad that you organized the way you did, and I went after Susan, because I was like, yeah, we came in the same time. We just, like, every semester we would huddle and be like, oh, what's happening next? Like, a lot of the attraction, I was like, I think she's going to cover that. I didn't touch bases with her. But just cover that. I'm going to talk about mentorship. Although I wrote my marginalia here that says bathroom story. I'm starting with bathroom story. That I think, you may or not remember this, but one of the many things that you're like not prepared for upon entering graduate school is like navigating certain types of relationships, and like the mentor, mentee, advisor, advisee, whatever you want to call it, relationship is like not something that you're prepped for. And the idea of like asking someone to like guide your comms or guide your dissertation is not something that you're like prepped for in a way that prepped like socialized as for dates or prom or that kind of crap. So I was like, okay, I was scheduled a meeting at been a semester or so. It was about time for me to get ready for comms, and I wanted to schedule a meeting just to like talk to Dr. Hinton. And I was like, all right, because I knew I wanted to ask him to be my advisor, but I just wasn't trying to. Again, I didn't know. I hadn't taken classes this semester. I need to get back in touch. Normally, here's the bathroom part. Normally, I had this good advice from somebody. Never go to the same bathroom, like on the hall you work or the hall you teach, or like an up or down floor, because you don't see your students right before class. I mean, we have to deal with them enough anyways. It's just too much. And I always followed this advice. And I especially followed this in my office because Alden and I are on the same floor. Second floor boroughs, pre-renovation boroughs. And for some strange reason I was nervous and I didn't go. And like he's in the bathroom. And he starts like talking to me. Like in the bathroom. Yeah, we have like a meeting in like 5 minutes. So then I'm just like, that was weird. Like, maybe it was weird, who cares? So then I just asked him to be my advisor 5 minutes later. We actually had the meeting. So and that seems very silly, but it also I'm actually gonna tie back about mentorship in out as an advisor. Anyway, all right, let me get back to that. Okay. In one of my first conferences, I think it was like maybe my second or third conference paper I gave, it was the Society of Southern Literature conference. It was right after I defended my comms. I was like working on my getting my ideas together for dissertation, that fun stage. But it was the first time that I was presenting in public aspects of the would-be dissertation book project. The first time I was doing that in public. And back then I was a younger, more vulnerable lad, and there were 3 people in attendance at that panel, and it was cutting because I'd been to other panels. There'd been good this crowd, or like even bit less than fine. But there were 3 people, and then one of the 4 panelists didn't show, which made one of the other 2 people who were presenting. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna like double my talking time. And then that person, their work, with all due respect, maybe they, I don't know. With all due respect, was on like translating Faulkner, which is really cool. But they got a whole lot of questions. It's like, well, yeah, like translation, things like change and are different. And that's all well and good. I'm not knocking the work, but they got a lot of questions because it was a very interesting topic. And I got nothing. I didn't get a single damn question. Even though there's somebody gone. There was like a token question to like the third panelist. And it was the first and only time that like my feelings were just like ever so slightly like hurt by the idea of like being at a conference. Like I got mean questions later. I whatever, that's fine. But I did something that I don't normally do, which was that I emailed like I just got a complaint to Aldon. I was like, I'm feeling like just a tiny bit sorry for myself. And he sent back, and I went through my email and I found it, and I'm gonna quote this email to you. Very short. I've had audiences of 2 and audiences of 2,000. The thing is the work. There's a little bit too logistically after that of like meeting or to talk about. But that was it. The thing is the work. And I use this line all the time. I use this line with my students on all the range that they teach. I say it to myself whenever I'm complaining about service or whatever else, or being a faculty senator and going to live meetings these days. Like I say to myself, the thing is the work, and it very much grounds me in like what we do matters in a sort of philosophical sense. My second story about mentorship is I'm gonna riff on music a little bit, and then it'll tie back into music. This is kind of a bit before I actually asked him to be my advisor. But I was attracted to the fact that Dr. NIELSEN was a musician, and I didn't understand what that meant, like at the time. I didn't understand what has been hinted at from Evie and from Susan, like what NIELSEN's relationship to music was. Because I entered grad school after playing saxophone like very regularly. I gigged very regularly. I had a quasi somewhat paying gig. I played weddings and stuff. I was like, oh man, if you like add this all up, it's like, almost have to like file taxes. And I had this, this silly dream of like, oh yeah, I could have been, if I wanted to hustle a bit more, I could have been like a lounge lizard kind of musician. And instead, I chose the more lucrative craft of being, right? As many folks here have. But music remains very central and important to my life. It's a fun fact. This is selfish now. I emceed my wedding last week, so I'm still riding that high. So when I asked him about music, I think this was at the 2011 FM Lit Conference at Penn State that Shirley put together. I asked like, oh yeah, who do you listen to on saxophone? And you're just like, everyone. But it wasn't like you or jazz saxophone. You're like, you weren't bragging, you weren't BSing me. It was like very true and sincere. And later on, we would have like actual conversations about this. But it was like, at first it was intimidating. Because again, I'm younger, earlier on, I'm not trying to necessarily impress, but I want to be, I thought I was right on this, I knew I was going to work on all of this. So, what this reminds me, and what this has told me about Dr. NIELSEN, is this insatiable curiosity. Many of us in this room share these own kind of traits, but to see that mentor for someone with the kind of academic and intellectual interest that I had was deeply inspiring. Later, when I got really into like punk rock and whatnot, he's one of only 2 people in the world with whom I could have conversations about Joe Strummer, lead singer of the Clash, in his solo career. And your dissertation gift to me was Clash, not a Clash record, which I very much appreciate him. And another fun fact on NIELSEN as I wrap up here, the man bought a straight tenor saxophone, so like very like not like the normal curly saxophone, but a straight one, which shows this sort of. And I was like, why don't you just do that? Nobody buys these things. You said was like the challenge. You said, I didn't see there's this difference. And again, these moments that I didn't necessarily talk about all the time meant something to me, and it made me reflect there on my own. That you're buying this instrument that belongs down at like the Museum of Fine Arts here, and like the whole history room. Nobody like sees these things anymore. But this is all to say that for years, your inveterate curiosity has inspired me, desire to know and appreciate and digest everything, and to continue doing so in whatever field it is that you are working in. In this case, I'm talking about the music. It is infectious. It has quietly motivated and inspired me, and it still does. So I also teach boundary boundary every single class. So freshman album all the way up. They can't get out of CLA games from me either. So thanks for that too. Thank you.
Album longer than anybody in this room, including Anna. So I was present when Alden and Anna met. So yeah, we go back to about 43 years ago. And I had come over from getting my master's degree at American University to start my PhD at George Washington University. Alden had been there, I think, a couple years already. And we met. We were introduced, he corrected me, we were introduced by Bob Gans, who directed Alden's dissertation. And we became friends pretty quickly there. And part of it was our shared interest in poetry, though not always the same poets. And our interest in music. And we formed the Bad Tenors Blues Band. I think our first performance was at my 30th birthday party in Arlington. Yeah, but in any event, I don't know if you all have read this Memoirs yet. This is a really wonderful book. It's kind of a memoir, but it's not really a memoir. Tyrone Williams, who wrote the introduction of this, really captures the spirit of it by saying that this album is playing all the changes on a prolific career in life in writing and music. And the last chapter in this book is a little bit about our Bad Tenors Blues Band days in DC. And it ends with Alden driving across the unrolling landscape right past the place of my birth, out in the middle of the plains and onto the whole entire opposite side of the country, blues and poetry, quaking earth waiting for me across the event horizon. He's Latin out for California there. That was probably soon after I had defended my dissertation, because you were present at that event, and I was present at his. I was actually Alden's the first reader of Reading Race, the first person to read it, and I didn't want to drag the book here, so on my phone, it's on the plane and all that. But I did drag this. I've got, if I can get it here. Well, anyway, he inscribed it for me, and I took a photo of the inscription, which I kind of want to read you. It's amusing. And it says, first it says X, his mark. Right, it says, for Richard, first and maybe last reader. and most esteemed member of my committee, as seen on page XI. And what he does in the acknowledgments, he includes me in his dissertation committee. So that's a rather amusing thing. Another thing that is a kind of a first, this is Alden's first book of any kind. It's called Heat Strings, and he has his website as Heat Strings Theory now. This is a Sultan of SWAT chapbook, SOS Books, which was a press that was started by Hugh Walthall and I, and Hugh Walthall was the person who selected poems Alden edited in 2019. The name of the book is A Spell in the Pokey. And so what happened was Hugh had been arrested at the May Day 1971 demonstrations, and he won money in a class action suit that he used to start this press. Okay, so my relationship with this book is also physical, because Lillian Weber and I laid it out. Okay, you had paste down type in those days. Yeah. So we sat at the Writers Center in Glen Echo, or I think it was, and we laid this whole book out. So this is not a signed one. I have a few copies of this still. If you want me, I'll send you. Anyway, so, you know, our shared interest in poetry and music is really lifelong. He inscribed Meme Wars to me as Twice Told Tales. And indeed, I knew a lot of stuff in this book before I read it, but it was a real joy to read. So one thing he talks about in this last chapter is our public appearances at various benefits and arts festivals. And I had to actually go look at his CV so I could get the exact dates of these performances. The first public, we did benefits for Pacifica radio station, which played jazz mostly, right? And they also had Grace Cavalieri's program, The Poet and the Poem, which is, I think, still going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Grace is not 90 or something now, isn't she? I think so. Anyway, so in 1985, Alden had been asked to play and to read some poetry at this Pacifica radio benefit in a downtown hotel somewhere. Can't remember the hotel, but and he initially had other people lined up to help him, and a couple of those fell through. So the day of the gig, he calls me up on the telephone and wants me to come down and play with him, but I was at the beach apparently. So he eventually got in touch with me. He said, "Bring your guitar down here," and so without rehearsal, we launched into a Jimmy Reed thing, and then I guess people dug it because we got asked back for one thing, and we also played at Ad Arts. Well, Octave Stevenson, who ran the library, he asked us to play at this Ad Arts festival, which was a big deal. It was downtown, and I think who was the headliner there?
That year was Gil Scott Heron.
Gil Scott Heron was the headliner, and we were just kind of an
The
opening
next
act.
time it was Sweet Honey in the Rock.
Yeah, it was Sweet Honey in the Rock, and also Mary Chapin Carpenter was playing at that one as well. So we got to share a stage with all these luminaries, and we played country blues, and got a mention by Royal Stokes, who was the music critic for the Washington Post then, who talked about the country blues tinged performances of Richard Flynn and Alden Nielsen, whose name he misspelled, as is typical. Yeah, and so I'm going to tell one more little short story, which is about when Alden met Anna. We used to have these Friday poetry readings, and we used to go to a bar called the Red Lion, which is right near George Washington University and we'd go there and hang out and cut up and stuff like that. And I don't know if we were still having the Friday afternoon poetry readings. I don't think we were, but we were still going to the bar. And the woman that Alden worked for, she fixed him up, I think, right? So we were there waiting for her to come into. So they met in a bar, yeah. And I was there and watching them. You could see the chemistry like that. I mean, it was incredible. So me and my friend Ross Taylor, we were sitting there. We were going, "Ooh, he's gone now." So, and then later on, when he had been in California and I was teaching at that point in Indiana State before the job I have now, I had an NEH seminar at Princeton, and I drove from Princeton down to DC to go to their wedding. So, and we've been such fast friends ever since. We usually only see each other at conferences, although we went out to Santa Barbara and had a lovely time with my wife. And when I was out on the Joni Mitchell extravaganza, I'm a huge Joni Mitchell fan. So yeah, I'm going to see her next in a few days in Washington State. Anyway, so yeah, so we drove up to Santa Barbara at the Joni Mitchell Hissing of Summer Lawns Fest at the Hollywood Bowl. They had Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter and all these, Shaka Khan, and all these people doing the whole album from beginning to the end. Joni wasn't there, but it was before her aneurysm too. So anyway, so yeah, you mean so much to me, and I'm so happy to be able here to tell a few little anecdotes.
you, Kathy.
Can I stand
You
there?
can
I
stand
like
there, yeah.
elbow you out of the way?
Yes.
So, I remember the first time that I read Alden's scholarship, and I was like, oh, this is how you write literary histories. This is how you do archival work. This is how you do close readings that really mean something in the context of life. But I had great teachers. I was lucky to attend these wonderful programs, but I count Alden as a teacher just through his work and the excitement that it generated and kind of a method of how to be a poetry critic in the world. And eventually I met Alden. I think I met Alden and Billy Joe maybe at the same time at these, these conferences and being conference buddies. And, Alden is the most generous person in the world, right? He's this, read his work and it's like, oh, it's Alden, it's Alden. And you meet him and he's super generous and just the greatest guy. And he, when my first monograph was published on Tulsa and Hughes and Baraka, he brought me out to Penn State and I got to meet some of his graduate students because he's always creating community and supporting the work of younger scholars and younger writers. And, because you might be in your little place thinking like, is anybody reading? Does anybody care about what I do? But Alden cares, he cares about the work and he's gonna, support the people who are doing the work. And then I was lucky enough at some point where I could, return the favor for the many things that Alden has done for me and be able to blurb some of his work. So I wanted to read what I wrote about the inside songs of Amir Baraka. So I wrote, noted scholar Alden NIELSEN, who took an entire generation back into the archive of African American poetry through his writing and teaching, now offers us a rare front row seat at Amir Baraka's many collaborative performances with eminent jazz musicians, including those he worked with in his own groups, the New York Art Quartet and Blue Arc. Drawing on our collection of rare recordings as well as his own observations of live performances he attended over a 35-year span of knowing Baraka, first as his student, later as friend and colleague, this volume reads like a conversation with NIELSEN in which he tells you everything you need to know about the soundings of Baraka's poems, both on and off the page, as well as the cultural institutions, political ideologies, and collaborative relationships that are initiated their production. So that shows like how he's just this really like living embodiment of literary culture, right? That so much of what he knows comes from his relationships that he has with people, including his long friendship with Amir Baraka. But this is the important part. So, some point after I met Alden, I received an email from him and it said, I think we have a Nebraska past in common. And I was like, what? I think we share a Nebraska past in common. So it turns out that in parts of our childhoods, Alden and I lived in towns in central Nebraska, which are only about 45 miles apart. You might know this as the metroplex of Kearney, Lexington, and Grand Island. I'm sure that's familiar to all of you. And but Alden lived in the big town, the one with the mall. So, like he was already up here, I was down here, he's already up here. So I wanted to give Alden a gift, a very practical gift because Midwesterners are very practical. So, Alden, I got you this very, very special gift. This is a Nebraska Hawaiian shirt, which I hope you will enjoy during your retirement. On the social medias, on Facebook, to know how much you appreciate it. So, thank you, Alden, for everything you've done.
My father's alma mater.
All right.
That's my thing.
Yeah.
News. I have good news and I have bad news. The neutral news is that, contrary to most people here, apparently I misunderstood the assignment. Rather than tell stories, because I'm not that good at it, I would speak in my love language, which is textual disquisition. I will actually talk about a poem by ALDON. The bad news is that it's not really a fun poem, but the good news is that it's a great poem. Hopefully, I won't put too much of a damper on the proceedings, but the poem I want to talk about is The Assembly of God at Jasper. I don't remember when I first read it. I know I heard it before I read it, and what I heard was a version of it put to music that ALDON emailed to us. In his email, ALDON marked it as radio-friendly censored, meaning it was missing its 10th section, a quote from Ida B. Wells herself, quoting a white woman's use of the N-word, and part of its 11th section, quoting Sunrise on use of the same word. This may have been for the best. Knowing things were missing in what I'd heard led me to consider how the recording of the Assembly of God at Jasper, how it riffs on the very logic of its text, which I read as a work about the impossibility and yet the necessity of remembrance in the face of dismemberment, an Orphic blues in reverse, if you will. We'll see if I have time to explain this in a way that makes sense. All right, the Assembly of God at Jasper opens with a series of images, plays on words and double entendres that might feel clever if they did not deal with absolute horror. And I quote, "Dry bone pavement, head skinned to hatred, could thin air muster cold resistance, severed to a certainty, spine-carried message, broken off in translation." Playing on words is serious business, as anybody who knows ALDON might already know. As serious as an effort to force sense out of one ostentatious inspiration for this poem, the lynch and murder of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas in 1998, beaten and dragged to death behind a truck. A murder so incredibly foul, even a Texan jury felt obliged to sentence 2 of the 3 culprits to death, the first time in the state's history that white murderers were executed for killing a black man. And so at first, considering the 12 parts of the poem, I thought it might be a take on the Stations of the Cross. And why not? Lynching poems have long evoked the suffering of Christ. But there are 14 stations. Station on the Cross. This poem only has 12, so much from my Catholic references. I should have known better. The Assembly of God mentioned in the title is a Pentecostal church. The Pentecost, the tale of tongues. The Pentecostals consider speaking in tongues as the initial evidence of spirit baptism. And it seems, so does ALDON, in this poem at least, which evokes time and again how language makes and breaks, and possibly mends again. The Pentecost then, there it lurks in the 2 afterwards sections of the poem, which feature comments of Texans about Byrd's murder, as horrifying as they are casual. There it is again in section 5, titled "They've Gotta Have It," quoting Susan Gubar's comments about the confessions of Nat Turner, not the ones pilfered by a white lawyer, the ones pilfered by a white writer. You might recognize this. Of course, the brouhaha at the publication of Tyrone's fictionalized account of a slave insurrection proved that the civil rights movement had intervened to usher in a period inhospitable to whites' use of black talk. Sorry, Tyrone, if you thought this was all you needed to reach salvation, you need to think again. From 1998, ALDON takes us back to 1969, the controversy around this book. And this is a sign of the poem's dynamic. Beginning with dismemberment, it assembles in reverse. So we do get more tongues, though they're hardly made of fire, and I quote again, "Severed tongue wriggles in English under lash. Below the waterline, we speak the names of our languages into an uncomprehending hold. Though it is everywhere here, English is not this nation's official language. Tongue severed from its country of origin, a severe tongue as well. This tongue was foreign to many who were made to speak it and who roam here in and between lines that murmur of the middle passage. The language in which ALDON writes is the same as that has so long been used to obfuscate and hide. And I quote again, "American English is a language in which there are no words for slavery." He writes in section 8. In and of itself, speaking in tongues is no evidence of spirit baptism. But then language is what we have no choice but to immerse ourselves into, if not for salvation, but at least for a modicum of sense. In an interview, ALDON says about his motivation to write the poem, I quote, "I felt the need to read something in the way of lyric that got at race and history." And there he goes, following spoken words where they will take us on a grim tour of Texas. Annie Ray Dixon died in bed at age 84. The bullet came from a policeman's gun. The blank between the two short stanzas rearranges meaning as we read, dreadful in the way it needs no explanation. So used have we become to seeing Black Americans, from Fred Hampton to Breonna Taylor, die in bed by cop. And further yet we go to Paris, Texas, 1893, where Henry Smith was tortured in front of over 3,000 people before being burned alive, the ordeal recorded on wax and replayed later for entertainment. Anti-lynching activist Samuel Burdett, describing his reaction to hearing the recording, wrote the following: "It were better that it all might be forgotten and that nothing of the same character should ever transpire again. The things seen and heard there have haunted the writer from that day to this." Here is what ALDON writes in section 9, entitled Race Records. 1893, Paris, Texas, Henry Smith, an early application of old technology, the first gramophone lynching. Perhaps as chilling as the thing itself is the looming insinuation that there would be other such gramophone lynchings. And this, of course, we also know to be true. Newer technologies have replaced the old ones, but the race records live on. Burdett was not one to bite his tongue. In speaking of forgetting, he expressed a wish, not a program. Haunted as he was, one can imagine that he hoped for an exorcism of sorts. Not sure how Pentecostals feel about the power of tongues to deal with hauntings, but I think I may have an idea where ALDON stands. His section 11, entitled Race Record, in the singular, evokes an episode of the life of Herman Poole Blount, jailed in 1942 for choosing conscientious objection over military service. When they opened the doors to release him, Sun Ra walked out. Call it a spirit baptism. Blount had walked in a Christian, he stepped out an alien on his way to speaking his own tongue. I'm not talking about Ra's poetry so much. Notoriously, ALDON NIELSEN is not exactly a big fan, as you might know. But about his music, of course, and the poem's final rearrangement. The last section reads as follows: Mans Lipscomb sang Motherless Children, played jackknife, clapped against the neck of that instrument, never let go that knife, died a natural death. So many ways to read these lines, most of them tongue-in-cheek. We should think the Texas bluesman Lipscomb lucky he didn't have to bring his jackknife to a gunfight in his bed. For all the looming threat packed in that blade, he was known to use it folded, ostensibly to slide rather than cut. A knife to undo all the cutting, maiming, and dismembering. A 12-bar blues of sorts, then, to put Orpheus back together. And who's to say that was not a metaphor? I'm not saying anything. I'm just listening. I heard all this in ALDON's poem, and you can too. And if you're not the reading type, there's a recorded musical version on YouTube, accessible to all of you. I can send you the URL link if you're interested. Let me know. Thank you, ALDON.
Such a love fest, and I thought it was going to be a roast. Anyway, when I first met ALDON, I was very young indeed. We're not going to name dates. And ALDON was already kind of a grown-up in the profession. He was, he was very beardy and articulate and professional. And I went to a lot of his papers, and I read his articles and his books. I was the second reader of
oh, that one.
And I read his poems, and I decided that this guy I had met and chatted with at so many events was the real deal. The real deal. And he's gotten over the years since to be very much more the real deal, as we all know. He's a groundbreaking scholar, critic, editor, anthologist, poet. Not to mention kind of an all-round smart guy. And a nice guy, which is actually rarer than it should be in both the academic and the poeticizing professions. But I don't really want to talk about ALDON as any of these things. I want to talk about Alden as technophile. Anybody else notice this? Hands, please.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
You know, Alden knows pretty much every effing thing there is to know about 20th century and contemporary poetry and poetics. African American avant-garde writing, C.L.R. James, Black liberatory thought, jazz, R&B. But if you really want to get Alden excited and talking, ask him about cameras or portable digital music players or guitar effects pedals. Now, Alden and I had chatted at maybe a dozen or two venues before I got him into a really deep, enthusiastic conversation about what was the best platform by which one could carry around one's entire music library on a portable device. Now, I'm not a camera guy myself, but I imagine you could do exactly the same thing with the conversation about what's the best camera to capture crystal clear candids of all the poets reading, musicians musicianing, and academics expound doing what academics do, right? Alden is, to put it bluntly, I will use a technical theoretical term, a gearhead. Okay, let me define that for the uninitiated. Among musicians, a gearhead is someone who is absolutely fascinated by musical gear, not just instruments, guitars, basses, keyboards, drums, harmonicas, though instruments are of course always primary, but by the various configurations of amplifiers, tube or solid state. By the way, sounds can be massaged and shaped by various effects pedals, by how signals can be transmitted through various grades of cables or wireless connections. A gearhead, in short, is fascinated by the range of technologies available for making recording music. Alden, like Wallace Stevens, you know what's coming, he plays a blue guitar, not literally. He also plays blues guitar, but he plays a blue guitar. And he also probably has an orange guitar and a yellow guitar and a sunburst finished guitar through blue and green and red effects pedals via orange or yellow cables, or a Bluetooth connection into a tweed or black amplifier, all in quest of just the right sound. And that's the key. Alden may be a gearhead, a technophile, but he's not in love with technology for its own sake. Like, you know, there's this guy you meet whenever you go to Guitar Center. And he owns 15 guitars. He's got a half dozen amps, and he has no idea how many effects pedals he owns, but all he could play is Smoke on the Water. Okay. For Alden, the technology is always in service to the experience. The MP3 player, the WAV file player, is not there for its own sake, but in order to reproduce as clearly as possible the music in which he's so immersed, which he loves so deeply. The cameras and the portable recorder, they may be cool toys in their own right, but what makes them important is their ability to capture the images and voices of the intellectuals to whose work he attends so deeply, the poets whose words so enthrall and provoke him. Human technologies, after all, are really only a series of increasingly sophisticated prostheses for extending the reach of our bodily senses. Alden is a connoisseur of those technologies, not like Elon Musk, not some grown-up kid with fancy toys, but for their ability to record and to get him closer to the most primal and joyous human experiences. The rhythm and harmony of music, the endless resources of the voice measured in argument, raised in song, weaving the colorful tapestries of poetry. And really the first and most important of our human technologies is language itself. And that's the technology that Alden's the most in love with, whose resources he's most closely studied and explored. So Alden may be a gearhead, but he's a gearhead of words. How's that for an epitaph?
Okay. We sort of.
Is this a weird dark poem to pick? But it's one of my favorites, so I'm gonna talk about it. So we shall see how that goes. But thank you all for being here. And echoing the chorus of thanks for Alden. So to, I guess, sort of start by echoing Kathy Lou a little bit. I will never forget when I first encountered Alden's criticism. It was the book Black Chant, Languages of African American Postmodernism. I was at the time a naive undergrad trying to pin down an inchoate senior research thesis idea that culminated in a horrible, clumsy analysis of some jazz poetry by Michael Harper, Ishmael Reed, and Al Young. But all of that sort of shameful past aside, I was fortunate, this is embarrassing work, I was fortunate my advisors heard something in this vague idea that made them recommend very early on in the process that I pick up this particular book, which I did late one night, and I remember where I was and exactly when this occurred. I'm confident, based on my very embarrassing marginal notes in my original beat-up copy of Black Chant, that at the tender age of 20, with one African American poetry course under my belt, the deft and incisive revision of literary history that makes this paradigm-shifting opus essential mostly went over my head. But I'm also confident that reading this book altered the trajectory of my scholarly career and perhaps my life. My notes in that battered, beat-up copy signal that over and over again, that book introduced me to names of poets that I'd never encountered before. I started circling them. And I had taken a lot of poetry classes, and even one or maybe two by that point, courses specifically in African American poetry. So that's not so much an indictment of those professors as it is, I think, a symptom of the literary historical problems that Alden was starting to make me aware of with every page. It was the first time I began to really consciously realize just how much there was to encounter and to parse within Black poetic traditions, and more importantly, how many factors had together conspired to eliminate so much of those ridges from view. I wound up feeling, to borrow the words of Emily Dickinson, as if the top of my head were taken off. I knew I was not just reading criticism, although of course Black Chant is a beautiful, masterful example of such, but also I could sense I was learning on the page from someone who could teach me so much in person. I knew before dawn that Penn State needed to be added to my list of potential places to apply for graduate school because of how much NIELSEN's text had helped me to see how circumscribed my initial ideas for a dissertation on African American poetry were. And I think I also sensed immediately that his scholarship was issuing always from a deeply poetic sensibility. I don't wear that dual hat, having given up writing poetry shortly after the tawdry attempts I produced amid my first middle school heartbreak, but luckily I had the gift in grad school of getting an up-close and personal view of what it means to read poetry as a poet, I think, on a lot of levels. The contours of my dissertation idea ultimately remained intact, but being in classrooms with ALDON in this kind of almost indescribable way, so I'm glad that Susan kind of started to gesture to this, just radically expanded my sense of the possibilities of poets to write about. ALDON has always kind of already been there before you in this rich and wonderful way that still to this day gives me constant reading recommendations. I don't know that I've ever met a scholar acquainted with quite as broad a range of poets' verse traditions and the various cultural productions in different genres and media for which they draw. It was regular fare for seminars to feature, beyond the rich discussion of the text at hand, numerous anecdotes about musical trends, about NIELSEN's personal encounters with these poets or those in her circles, and about the entire kind of relevant range of American history writ large. I know that I don't have the poet's insight that ALDON has into craft, nuances of word choice, and of positioning oneself in relationship to literary inheritances that makes the prose sing so beautifully, Susan and Kathy were talking about. But I'm grateful for what it models as aspirational possibility, even as many benefiting from this lucid scholarship, I think still sometimes remain unaware that he is a talented poet himself. I also was very reminded of this yesterday when he was speaking on the Baraka panel. I admire and aspire to, but am not able always to see the types of sort of unusual connections between ideas that his poetic mind lets him forge, these kind of ingenious maneuvers that might initially surprise and then ultimately come to seem argumentatively inevitable, that characterize the way he approaches the work. I also didn't fully realize until I was nearing the end of my time in graduate school that I had kind of luckily stumbled upon an advisor who is absolutely uncommonly, genuinely generous.
Yeah.
As the most key example, it's a slightly different experience than what Susan and Justin were talking about. When I first started working as ALDON's research assistant, he had me tracking down and transcribing text by Lorenzo Thomas for a collected volume he was planning. And I had no idea at that early stage of graduate school that I would be lucky enough for this to flourish into a lengthy and kind of still ongoing co-editorial partnership for Thomas's work. I bring this up to point out that not a lot of advisors would have been willing to see enough potential in an enthusiastic but very clueless young graduate student to offer co-editorship to someone like me based on the time I devoted to the project at the stage when he did. And so I ultimately wound up feeling so grateful, not so much for the kind of line item on my CV, because my institution so much cares about the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas, but for the experience I garnered with the kind of fastidious and arduous work that's involved with lovingly, carefully editing a collective poems of someone as kind of iconoclastic and idiosyncratic as Thomas. And so I'm also ultimately very grateful and appreciative for that template of generosity he provided, that's kind of become an exemplar of how I hope that I'm able to try to relate to my own students. I also realized in looking back through some of his work while preparing for this roundtable that my propensity for trying to give poets the last word in my publications, which pisses off a lot of reviewers, but which I'm loath to give up on, might come from ALDON, because he does that gesture a lot. So as a result, I want to wrap up here with a bit of a reading of one of ALDON's own poems. So, and again, I questioned picking this because it's the final poem of Spidercone, and it's called Eventual Epitaph. So like, is that a little bleak for this occasion? But let me quote it anyway in its entirety. This is a 2-line poem, and I think it's just too great of an exemplification of his poetic prowess and his intertextual range and his humor not to sit with for a moment today. So the poem just reads, "I've been buked and I've been scorned. I once was woke, but now I'm mourned." So, we all recognize the first line of this couplet. There's a reference to the gospel classic, most famously performed by Mahalia at the March on Washington just before King's speech. And in the second line, we have this amazing kind of intertextual revision of Amazing Grace. The genre of a poet kind of preemptively writing his own epitaph gets turned on its head here, so that it's not so much an attempt at forestalling erasure and ensuring some kind of arrogant immortality, but instead almost a recognition of insignificance or of passing fads. And so I feel like this is, in a sense to me, a classic ALDON style in a nutshell, suffused with these so many wide-ranging in so little space literary, musical, cultural reference points, and infused with the kind of self-effacing, self-deprecating humor that somehow, despite the brilliance of it all, still characterize his pedagogy and kind of every interaction you have with him, even as he's teaching you so much. So luckily for all of us here, I think that despite the eventual epitaph gesture, ALDON clearly still has many acts left before him, and so nothing could less warrant mourning than all of these contributions we've all been talking about here today. And so instead today, I just want to bring thanks and celebration for myself and for everybody who's here to celebrate this afternoon. So thank you all.
Completely understood the assignment.
So I'm reading from Stepping Razor. It's an interesting poem I've always liked. The Very Large Array. Listen to this. Things that cannot be compared, streaming in before we're prepared. Adequate answer from one what seems a word, from another only acute direction. We think something more subtle than any idea speeds its way across blank space. We receive a leaky verb, an error message. We've waited so long to be spoken back to that. Our own desire has found itself in places where listening cannot occur. What sound cannot bear, what meaning can't convey itself coming and going. In the eloquence of the empty, what the homeless hear wandering and attempt in their own way, what was shouted into shotgun houses, scattering the brain fever birds from the back stoop. A dissonance we can sense, a foe in the static. Why there is no getting in touch, the sound of our own intent as the largest of listenings is left to its own. ALDON
We'll play with the Q&A a little bit. Apparently there are people here who would like to say a few things about ALDON. James Smethurst.
Oh, okay. So, I don't remember exactly when I met ALDON in person for the first time. It might have been at one of the National Poetry Foundation conferences in Orono, Maine, and I went to the University of Maine system, back or beyond, even by the standards of Maine. But, and ALDON reminded me again, although I was thinking of it recently, of a truly terrifying panel that we were on at a conference at Howard University in honor of Mary Baraka, where Mary Baraka and Amina Baraka were sitting about where Evie Shockley is sitting, while on a panel, ALDON was at the far end. Then there was Woody King, the director, me, and Al Freeman Jr., who played Clay in the movie version of Dutchman, and I thought, like, oh God. And one of the things that struck me was that I was really ready to fall out, and ALDON remained cool, witty, capacious as usual. And I said, I'm impressed by that. But really, what I do remember about ALDON, the thing that impressed, way back, long ago and far, far away, as the saying goes, was before I met him. And so this was a long time ago, and I was beginning to work on a project on the Black Arts Movement. And I was thinking, like, okay, how am I going to do this? It's such a big and varied group of people in so many genres that are so mashed up together. So how do I do this? How do I meet, my responsibilities towards the material and the artists while, being as capacious and adventurous as they were. And that was around the time that Black Chant came out. And I read Black Chant, and I said, that's what I'm talking about. That it was this amazing book that, we've talked about Alden's, sort of the capaciousness of his mind, his adventurousness, but also the care that he took with the historicizing, with the reading, with the listening, the way he put it together, to me was, so inspiring to me. It's something, frankly, not only did I aspire to them, but I continue to aspire to, and especially as Alden's work has gone on, integral music, but also the anthologies, the anthologies he did with Laurie Shire, the Lorenzo thing with Laura. All these things. That care, as well as the, sort of gave me a kind of model. Anyone who knows our work knows we're not exactly the same on how we come at stuff, but though, maybe not so far, especially once you, say, oh wow, see how art James, I can get behind. But just a kind of model saying, like, okay, I can understand how this works, especially in those days, because other than Lorenzo Thomas himself, in some of his essays, and Billy Joe Harris writing about Baraka, Kimberly Benson, but people writing about single figures. There wasn't a lot of models for me out there, and I was like, okay, this is something I can work with. And I remember, I remain, tremendously grateful for that, and of course, I was saying to Alden earlier, like they said in Monty Python, not dead yet. A few more good things may come out before we're done.
I often tell Alden that I want to be like him when I grow up. And what I mean is that I want to realize the model he has set, that a scholar can be a writer. I've understood myself to be a scholar. Do the research, put the ideas together, make sure you do your citations, you make your argument, you do your original argument, which means sometimes you unfairly argue against the people who came before you. But when you read Alden's scholarship, you get stories.
Yeah.
And you get stories that bring all the ideas and the details together. And the stories are also personal stories. It's easy to set up the straw man from the people in your department who annoy you. But Alden tells the story that actually launches the argument. Yeah. And he does it with such care and integrity. And he brings the ideas together with such care and integrity and makes it beautiful, because the beauty is part of the ideas. You want to elevate the ideas by making it clear and accessible and moving to the readers. If you want to give the poet the last word, then try to be like the poets yourself and care about the language that you use. So when Alden suggests something, I try to do it. I was having trouble coming up with my next project, and Alden said, and I quote, "You should write about Umbra," end quote. And so I have, and will continue to do so. I know that I won't be able to be the great scholarly raconteur that Alden Nielsen is, but I will aspire always to write my scholarship as a writer and to bring that joy and care and integrity to it so that hopefully people will find the kind of inspiration, or at least close to the kind of inspiration that books like Black Chant have meant to me. So thank you so much, Alden, for being who you are.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura Hinton. I'm the proud self-elected treasurer of the ALDON NIELSEN Poetic Society. I had a drink last night with some of his other society members. And I choose treasurer because I'm sure there's a lot of money involved. I first met Alden, or I first got to know him through his writing, just before the new millennium, as an editor. My friend Cynthia Hogan and I decided to publish a book that on innovative women's writing, which at that time hadn't been explored at nearly as much as we thought it should be. And this person named ALDON NIELSEN, who shares a middle name with me, sent in this piece called Capillary Currents, Jane Cortez. The title itself kind of threw me back because, you know, it's the logic of the piece, but it's a work of poetry in of itself. The music is already there. By the time the ear falls prey to the groove, the music is already multiplying, leveling monuments to expectation and erecting newer castles in the air. Layering with open work areas dangerously unguarded. This is not at all unusual these days and never was. Still, each generation hears ellipses. Still, Jane Cortez is already listening, present tense as she begins. I see Chano Pozo. The band is already at play. The 7 minutes and 31 seconds of the poem's second side in Cortez's 1982 recording, There It Is, which without a whoop intriguingly prefigures the double variant versions of the next decade's rap hit, Oop, There It Is. That was a parenthetical clause. Open with percussive punctuation, elliptical hand patterns on bongo and congo, look ahead to what we will hear of Chano Pozo in the poem, while adverting to the backward glance, adverting to the backward glance of the poem's title. As the other instruments intervene, a melodic whirl ensues. There is a discernible tonal reference point, but which we seem to be free of strict key. Wow. I said to Cynthia, I want this at the end of the book, just before Rachel Blauduclas's draft, which became our afterword. It just is stunning. I've been teaching this essay ever since to my students because I think it's a great, magnificent introduction to Jane Cortez. And I'm just here to thank Alden for so many things, for introducing me first to Jane Cortez because I didn't know about her. I was trained in feminist thought and not even trained in poetics really at Stanford, and we didn't do Jane Cortez back then. We still don't do Jane Cortez, not enough, and I keep teaching her at the City College of New York where no one else does, although most of my students are Black New Yorkers. Then I got to know him, and what a great guy. And I got to know him because he kept saying he would agree to be on one of the many strange programs I have created. Evie Shockley also was part of one. We went to Orono and I had kind of an in with one of the people organizing it, and they gave me a space and they gave me this music room full of instruments and said, here, if you want to do a performance out of your books, here it is. Good luck. And so we left, and I had driven in a whole bunch of musical equipment from New York or something, and in the trunk of my car. Alden and Evie probably helped me get it out of the car, and we created this program out of poetry. And but it was was Alden's suggestion we provide booze. But everybody left. We were very cunning. They left the sign up and read event at 10 o'clock that night, and they came over to us. And they heard our work instead. He got the beer and I got the wine. And so I've been collaborating with ever since in really little silly things. Then finally I got to meet Anna. It was actually over Zoom during the pandemic, and we would have cocktail parties with a small group of people, and Anna and Alden would be sitting there with their palm trees waving. This technology, and their martini glasses, and they looked like they were wearing that Nebraska. I want to have a Zoom party with you, and I want you to wear that shirt. I didn't grow up in Nebraska, but I grew up next door in Rapid City, South Dakota. And I'm just proud to have a friend from that background who's done so much, who's pointed the way how to really write literary criticism so that it's not boring, but that it does something for us, just like poetry does something for us. And I could just say so many things, but I'm just very, very grateful for this person in our midst who's shown us so much. And thank you.
Anette.
I'm Anette Debow. Alden and I have different memories of how we met. In my memory, it was American Studies. I was a grad student. When I got the program, I was so excited I'd been accepted, and then I saw the panel I had been put on, which was a lot of people like Alden. And we all talked, and then the questions started, and as you can imagine, they were mostly about Black chant. And so eventually, Alden and the respondent came and started asking me questions. And it might have been the best preparation I could have gotten for my orals for the rest of my career. And I think that chance meeting there and everything that followed, letters, dinners, drinks, I think one thing we need to thank you for is the culture that you have created. It is a gift to be able to do that, and you are so very good at it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shirley. I think I might be Alden's oldest in years working together colleague at Penn State.
At Penn State.
In the room. Some qualifiers for that. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for being here, and JP for organizing this. It couldn't be a more beautiful tribute. I think for me, bearing witness to what Alden has done in the field through his students is really what is so profound. I actually sat on a lot of these committees with Alden, and I learned from him how to be on committees. I learned from him how to do this work. He was there when I got to Penn State, and he became really one of my most trusted friends and colleagues. And we very quietly, in certain kinds of ways, sat on committees, did search committees. I mean, these are the things that we're not talking about in this room, but that I got to see all of that kind of work too. And a stalwart commitment to African American literature, to ethnic literatures, and what that meant to try to do that work, that institutional work as well. But I just wanted to, and also with the African American Literature Conferences that so many people were a part of, that Alden quietly sat in the background and would say, what about this person? What about this? I mean, really sat in the background and helped map out the whole programming. And so much of what we see, you know, the scholarship and the work, there's also so much behind the scenes that has gone into that. And I'm just so grateful that I got to, you know, get through my first 16 years at Penn State with his support. I don't know what I'm gonna do. But hopefully we can find ways to carry on. But thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming out, and JP for organizing such a beautiful inspiration and tribute.
Okay, let's not forget that Alden is also a poet. So, from a poet to a poet.